All right, let's just jump right into this. Welcome back to another deep dive in the Explainer. Today we're decoding an incredibly unique, highly stylized worldview presented in a publication called Publication Magazine. Now, at first glance, you'd look at this source and think it's pure science fiction. But as we're going to see, it's actually a super intricate framework used to deliver some really intense, deeply grounded critiques of modern American socio-economic systems. Right out of the gate, we are plunged headfirst into this esoteric, multiversal sci-fi lore. I mean, read this quote. Psycho Venga emerges from the rift. Words like slip flow, counterflow, and SH1 resonance, it honestly sounds like you just cracked open a high-end graphic novel, right? You're completely immersed in an alternate reality. But here's the catch. This whole sci-fi universe, it actually serves as a deliberate, metaphorical backdrop for very serious real-world socio-political commentary. It's essentially a Trojan horse for systemic analysis. So, to truly understand what the text is doing here, we have to define its core framework. The author uses these concepts, what they refer to as sovereign diagnostics, as literal diagnostic tools. They author their work as mythic infrastructure and a cinematic indictment. And what that basically means is they aren't just making your standard everyday political endorsements. They're objectively analyzing structural societal collapse by mapping real-world inequalities directly onto this grand cosmic narrative. It's a completely wild way to step outside normal political discourse and view systemic issues from an almost detached, multiversal vantage point.
To help translate this dense material, we're going to cover four main things today. The sovereign diagnostic framework, how they argue the model minority was manufactured, the negative reinforcement cycle, and finally, architectures of systemic sabotage.
Let's kick things off with Section 1 and look at the actual diagnostic structure framing these publications.
The entire narrative across this magazine is presented under the incredibly meticulous, official-sounding guise of the Cosmic University. It's helmed by a figure named Dr. Melvin Sewell, who holds an M.Sc and a Ph.D. and is labeled as the academic dean and diagnostic architect of the Cosmic University of Echo-Rift Studies IX. You see what they're doing here? The author is blending the rigorous, dry aesthetic of academic credentials with a completely fictional, multiversal institution. It creates this fascinating tone of absolute, clinical authority applied to reality-bending concepts.
And this dual-layer approach is absolutely brilliant. On one side, you have this multiversal sci-fi framing, talking about quantum consciousness and slip flows. But running right parallel to that are real-world systemic critiques. The text is actually discussing things like the 1965 Immigration Act, labor underemployment, and Social Security Disability Insurance, or SSDI deductions. The genius here is that it forces you to look at mundane, boring real-world bureaucracy as if it were a deliberate, alien architecture designed specifically for containment.
Moving right along to Section 2, let's explore their first major historical argument regarding racial hierarchies in America.
The publication categorizes the model minority myth not as some natural sociological phenomenon, but as a heavily curated historical timeline. The text outlines a deliberate progression, literally stretching all the way back to the 1882 Exclusion Act, shifting gears with the 1965 Immigration Act, accelerating in the 90s with H-1B visas, all the way to the curated elites we see today. By mapping this out chronologically, the source argues that demographics were intentionally manipulated over more than a century.
The author posits a really specific thesis here. They claim that America actively curated elite populations out of what were historically uneducated majorities in their home countries. According to the text, the whole purpose behind manufacturing this model minority myth was completely deliberate. It argues this was done to reinforce white supremacy by deliberately elevating Asians above blacks in the societal hierarchy, basically creating a buffer class and a weaponized narrative of success.
And to back this up, the text points to demographic data from China and India spanning 70 years, looking specifically at 1950, 1980, and 2020. The argument here is that by selectively importing the most resourced individuals from these nations, while ignoring the largely uneducated majorities of those same nations back in the 50s and 80s, the U.S. artificially shifted its domestic racial dynamics. So they aren't presenting this as just an accident of immigration, but as a calculated diagnostic of systemic engineering.
Okay, so if that's the external manufacturing, what about the internal side? How is domestic suppression maintained according to the text? That brings us to Section 3, the negative reinforcement cycle.
The framework argues that Black graduates face a very specific, structured, five-step process that it calls the negative reinforcement barrier. Step 1, rising attainment. More Black graduates enter the labor market. But then, boom, they hit Step 2, underemployment.
Their degrees just aren't rewarded with aligned jobs or equitable pay. Which brings us to step 3, a shift in community perception. Suddenly, education is seen as way less rewarding. That inevitably triggers step 4, enrollment declines. And finally, in step 5, this resulting decline is weaponized by the dominant hierarchy as supposed proof of lower ambition or capability.
So the huge takeaway here is that this lack of financial reward fundamentally shatters the educational pipeline. Underemployment actively discourages the pursuit of advanced education for the next generation. And this essentially does the heavy lifting for the hierarchy, right? It sustains the racial disparity by creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is then turned around and used to validate that manufactured model minority myth we just looked at.
Which brings us to our final part. Section 4, Architectures of Systemic Sabotage.
The magazine's archival records categorize U.S. systemic sabotage into 4 distinct pillars, and they claim these aren't just bureaucratic oopsies, they're orchestrated destabilization strategies. You've got the financial pillar, which includes forced SSA deductions and treasury offsets. The environmental pillar, citing hostile placements in mold-infested welfare shelters designed to literally erode your health. The psychological pillar points to digital isolation and mocking communications, perfectly timed with those SSDI reductions. And finally, the loan passport pillar, which acts as this ultimate legal trap.
This creates what the author describes as a terrifying macro-level entrapment. The text claims SSDI deductions are used to intentionally collapse a target's survival income. So totally starved of resources, the victim is forced into relying on U.S. State Department repatriation loans just to survive. But here's the kicker. These loans mandate the surrender of your passport. This cycle fundamentally strips away their international mobility and completely revokes their sovereign autonomy. It's an absolutely brutal closed loop of containment.
Ultimately, the author uses all this archival documentation to frame the United States not just as a flawed government, but as a deliberate architect of multiversal systemic harm. By wrapping grounded complaints about welfare housing, social security, and immigration into this epic language of multiversal convergence and sovereign continuity, the text elevates everyday, boring bureaucratic suffering into a cosmic battle against an architect of sabotage.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative question to chew on. Does filtering our real-world, often mundane bureaucratic inequalities through the lens of esoteric, sci-fi mythic infrastructure actually change how we see them? Does making the system look like an alien, multiversal architect of sabotage help us better diagnose and maybe even dismantle these modern societal barriers? Whatever the answer, it for sure forces you to look at a stack of boring government paperwork in a completely unforgettable way. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning the frameworks around you.